Okay, I'm talking about demonstratives and topic-related functions in both Papuan and Oceanic languages. We know a lot about demonstratives and that they are used in very different ways, and there's at least these four established: situational use, discourse dialectic use, anaphoric and tracking use, and recognitional use. And there's a lot of research about demonstratives, and there's a surprising amount of things that we don't know yet about demonstratives, I find. Oh, did I just lose this? I'll talk about the anaphoric use, among other things, so kind of picking up where Manfred has left off to some extent. So the anaphoric and tracking use is often described in the literature as having, or demonstratives in that use, as having certain restrictions in that they can only track certain types of reference. So they can't just track any old vanilla noun phrase. And there seemed to be a bit of a paradox, or one can construe it as a paradox, that on the one hand, demonstratives are described in the literature as excluding the most prominent entity as a possible antecedent. So they cannot anaphorically refer back to the most prominent one. And the most prominent one is described or defined as sentence level topic. So sentence level in the sense of information structure sense topics. And that's, I've seen this taken in the literature as kind of established facts, at least by some people. On the other hand, we find that demonstratives tend to track discourse prominent entities. So there can be discourse topic, major story characters, unexpected, resumptive, contrastive, and or emphatic reference. So they don't like to take the most prominent entity, but the entity has to be prominent in some sense. And this latter category includes, at least in some languages, sentence-level topics. I'm not sure whether this really is a paradox. It may be different notions of topics that play into this, but it's also noteworthy that this observation that they do not track the entity or refer back to the entity that is the sentence-level topic is actually coming exclusively, as far as I'm aware, from European languages, while the description here, the second point, that they track highly prominent entities is from a more mixed cross-linguistic sample, or I've seen claims from different language groups in any case, and this sentence-level topics are clearly included or even preferred, or the restricted type of antecedent has been suggested in Papuan and Oceanic languages, and that's what I'm talking about here. So De Vries suggests that there are certain what he calls topic-related functions, and I'm suggesting that he talks about Papuan languages, and there's clearly evidence that Oceanic languages show similar patterns. And the topic-related functions that De Vries considers are anaphoric reference, topic marking, and clause backgrounding. And in his paper, he kind of shows the connectedness between these functions in a very interesting way. So we find this is well known in many Papuan languages, and Papuanists kind of say, yep, so what? There's very little discussion that I'm aware of this in Oceanic languages, and there is very little discussion of this in the cross-linguistic typological literature. There's kind of a mention referring to De Vries, but I think there's a paper in prep that, from a more typological perspective, that mentioned this, but again, restricted, as far as I know, to Papuan languages. Now, in the literature, we find discussion of topic marking and clause backgrounding, subordination, and clause connectives, and famously Hyman's description of conditional clauses as topics. We also find demonstratives, the link between demonstratives and clause backgrounding, subordination, connectives. I'm kind of making that one mixed bag. One can and should distinguish there, but I'm using that as an overarching category. So we find demonstratives described as sentence connectives, connectives, complementizers, relative clause markers, clause background devices, and non-embedded clausal nominalizations. So we have this topic marking and clause backgrounding and demonstratives and clause backgrounding, but not so much demonstratives and topic marking as kind of a link or possible grammaticalization chain. But you also see that the authors, at least that I'm listing, there are probably many more, but they're kind of, you know, in the Papuan oceanic literature, so a lot of the data seems to come also from this realm. So let's look at some examples, demonstrative in topic-related functions. This is the work by De Vries on Wambon. It's a Trans-New Guinea language of Irian Jaya. And Wambon has a 3-term demonstrative system, meaning there are 3 demonstratives, and they're making 3 diacritic distinctions. And these distinctions are can be described as a person-based system, which means one is anchored with the speaker, so close to me, close to you, versus distal. Now, all demonstrative systems, I think, are actually person-based in the sense that they're all anchored at the speaker. But when we say a person-based system, we mean speaker and addressee as anchor points. And then comparing that to a system where it's close to speaker, medial distant from speaker, further, this is normally called a distance-based system, as opposed to a person-based system, which also worries about the addressee. So it has a person-based system, 3 terms, and I'm giving you an example here of the exophoric use, so a situational, spatially deictic use. So that is a woman. We find one of the demonstratives here. We also find the same demonstrative in anaphoric tracking use, or De Vries describes this one as anaphoric resumptive reference. And we find the same form, or grammaticalized version of the same form, which is now a suffix and labeled topic, as marking a noun as topic. So as for that man, he is ill. And again, the same form, topic, suffix, as a marker of, or having scope of a whole clause. And these are subordination, clause backgrounding type constructions. So we have a conditional construction. In the first case, if the Dogal River rises, then we do not want to go to this place. And it's rendered in Wambon as the Dogal River rises topic, we don't want to go. Then we have the relative clause construction. The sago which I bought yesterday is good, which is rendered as the sago I bought it yesterday topic, it is good. So the same marker that we've seen in these other functions. Now we find very similar patterns in a number of other Papuan languages. There is Wambon and Korowai, Usan, Karafa, and Ruma, which are all from the Trans-New Guinea phylum. But there are also 2 other languages I'm aware of from other Papuan families, groups, whatever we might want to call them. I'm not going to show you the actual data from the other languages, but the summary table. We find in almost all of these languages, all 3 functions clearly described and covered, except in Apma, I have not found any statements about this clause backgrounding use, because that was a paper that was specifically about topic marking and noun as scope, so it may or may not be present there. What I also found was that the same forms that were popping up in these 3 topic-related functions that De Vries describes is an additional function in at least 3 languages, which I've labeled here peak or surprise. That goes back to the notion of narrative peak. It's a term by Longecker, which is kind of the same thing as evaluation in the sense of the above. So it's kind of marking the important bit of the narrative, saying, hello, wake up, this is the dramatic high point, or this is the punchline of the story, I don't want you to miss this. So these demonstratives pop up with this function. And that's, again, something I didn't look for, which kind of came up in some of the descriptions. This is partly, I think, due to some of these descriptions are from SIL linguists, and SIL linguists are more aware of Longecker's work and are more aware of the notion of narrative peak, and so that may actually translate into where we find this as a described function. So we find them in all of these 3. In one case, we're not sure about the clause backgrounding, and then we find them peak marking in addition in some of them. Now, looking briefly at some oceanic data, this is the only data in this little study that comes from my own research. Saliba-Logea is a Western Oceanic language of Papua New Guinea, and again, it has a 3-tone system, and it's also a person-based system. You find, thank you, here an example of the exophoric use, so situational spatial deictic use. That one near you is the shell I mean, Temeta cisenaede. Here's an example of showing the same form as a topic marker. I think the functions of this marker, meta, in terms of a topic marker, is more discourse topic than information structure topic, but there seems to be no exclusion, no problem with information structure topics. So I think the function is marking discourse topics, but they can at the same time be the information structure topic. And we also find, again, the same marker as a close backgrounding device. The example here is having flown down, it pecked the man's head, which is it flies down, topic, it pecks the man's head. There's no evidence in Saliba that this is really a hypotactic subordination type construction. These are two main clauses which are linked by this topic marker. I have skipped the anaphoric tracking use question of this and coming to this now. The same marker does not function as an anaphoric tracking device. And I think the reason for that, or what's mixing with that, is that there is a dedicated anaphoric marker also from a demonstrative paradigm that's doing all the anaphoric tracking. And there's an interesting parallel and interaction, but we have not the same form topic marker meta that occurs in this context. And again, we find similar patterns in other oceanic languages, although I have a very small set so far. We have 3 which are all from the Papuan tip cluster. 2 of them are actually from the same dialect chain, Suawik. And we have 1 outside Western Oceanic from Alex Francois' works on MOTLAB, and he describes that in his thesis and in his typological overview with exactly the same parallel function. I keep seeing you nod, right? So here's again a table of this. The 4 languages. I have no information about Buhutu, very closely related to Saliba. I think they probably also have this dedicated anaphoric tracker, therefore we don't have the same demonstrative. But topic marking and backgrounding, close backgrounding, is performed by the same demonstrative. In Saliba, I'm saying no here because it's not the same form. But in Gapapaiwa and MOTLAB, we have the same form or forms derived, grammaticalized from the same form in these 3 functions, but I have no evidence for the marking of this narrative peak function so far. So now the same table that I've already shown you, just for comparison, the Papuan languages and the Oceanic languages, very similar. One difference I would point out that in the Papuan languages, this close backgrounding function often is actually subordinating, and these are on the basis of the author's descriptions, hypotactic subordinate constructions, while as far as I can see in the Austronesian, the Oceanic ones, it's backgrounding, it's a discourse mechanism, but not a subordination as such. And the other difference is that we have no examples of the peak marking so far. Okay, so clear parallels in the Papuan, the Oceanic languages. This may be an areal pattern, so there may be something happening in this area. It could also be that this is much broader and we haven't really have the description, haven't really discussed it, or haven't been able to discuss it because from the European literature we know that that can't be the case, so we don't really look there. You know, there's always this problem of the tendency of taking things that are tested in or European languages as a universal before we stumble over them elsewhere. Interesting to note is that in each of the languages, it tends to be one particular form that is used in all 3 contexts, either exclusively or clearly preferred, but there may be other options that are then mixed with emotional deictic connotations, things like that. So here is an overview. I'm not giving you the actual forms, but we have the languages, the system types. So we have some person-based system and some distance-based systems. Most of them are 3-way deictic distinctions. In one case, we have a 2-way deictic distinction. In one case here, the 4-way deictic distinctions. I'm not totally sure about this one. It kind of it takes one of those falsetto ooh as a extra distal distinction, and I'm not sure to what extent that is really a morpheme in that paradigm. So it may be a matter of analysis by different authors of similar data. In some cases, we have more than the more demonstratives than when I say, like in USAN, it's a two-way deictic distinction. There are actually four demonstratives, but it's one proximal form and three distal forms, like up, down, and something like that. So I'm kind of trying to boil this down to less noise in the system type in order to try to compare. Okay, and so what we find is that in the languages with a three-way deictic distinction, the distant-based systems choose the medial form in this small data set, and in the person-based systems, it's the addressee-anchored form consistently. In the two-way deictic distinctions, we find it's the proximal form that is used for these functions. Now you could say, who cares? Narrative peak. This is actually really, really interesting because we have totally conflicting statements in the literature of which demonstrative is the default choice for anaphora. We have predictions that it's proximal, medial, addressee-based, and distal. They all exist, all very good linguists, and the question is, how can we fine-tune our discussion to actually talk about the same thing? So, different languages, different notion of proximal, different notion of anaphoric reference are all playing into this. So now you think it's your time to ask questions. It is, but first I give you my questions. So I'd be really interested to hear about demonstratives in these type of uses in the languages of your expertise. So questions are, which demonstratives are used for anaphoric reference? Is there something like an anaphoric article? Is there something like a definite article? Going back to things that Manfred mentioned, and there's an important distinction that, among other people, Loebner has talked about. Are demonstratives used as topic markers, and then what type of topic marker? Are they used as clause backgrounding devices, subordinators, and or clause connectives? And which forms are used for that function? Is it the same form as for anaphoric tracking, or is there a choice? And then also we need to, do some work in being better at describing demonstrative systems. Person-based versus distance-based is not a trivial distinction because typically addressee clause demonstratives are medial distance from the speaker. So you need to test that in scenarios where you separate those two parameters. There is a tool by Wilkins which does exactly that, which is really helpful. But also, how many deictic distance-based distinctions are there, and how many non-deictic distinctions are there? I mentioned USAN as a 4-term system, but actually it's a two-way deictic split. Are there anaphoric forms, or are there attention redirecting forms like have been described for Turkish? There may be forms in the paradigm which are not deictic but are in the same paradigm and may have an effect on. So I'm asking these questions because I assume that in order to answer the question of what form is used for anaphora, we actually need to first say, well, in what type of system? Because there may be different choices in different types of system. So more questions than answers, but I thank you very much for being here at this late hour. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There is any question?
Alex.
Thanks, Anna. I learned a lot. I had no idea that Papuan, that it was so common in Papuan languages. And my question was, my comment was going to be about, indeed, that surprise effect, which surprised me quite a lot. This effect, rather than that one. Okay. The way I was understanding the MOTLAB data and the fact that it was the addressee deictic, addressee-based deictic, had to do with, backgrounding a clause or an event because it's shared knowledge, because it's sort of knowledge that
it's already
belongs to you, that's right, in your mind and so on. So if I say, you remember we went to the beach the other day, and and that would be backgrounded because you're supposed to remember it. It's already yours, as you said. And then the new information whatever comes after would not be located in you yet, because that's the point of me speaking, right? Explaining something that maybe you don't know. So I wouldn't expect the same addressee, you know.
So you think
in this case, I
more,
would, yeah.
more naturally backgrounding than kind of highlighting.
To me, it's quite the opposite, right? I mean, highlighting if I had to. I mean, MATLAB doesn't do either. It doesn't use either this or that for any form of surprise thing. So maybe I was going to ask you, what would be a typical context for that demonstrative to be used in a peak surprise thing?
In the peak surprise, well, exactly in the kind of peak surprise kind of, this is the important bit, and oh man, then I almost died of fright, that kind of context. But I think your comment is relevant not just for the narrative of peak surprise function. I think even the three topicality functions that de Vries described are kind of a very odd mixed bag, right? There's topic, hey, this is what we're talking about. And then there is the, well, you know, anaphora is already with you, and the backgrounding of clauses. And I think there is an inherent schizophrenic problem with topics, because they say, hey, this is what we're talking about. It's important because this is what we're talking about. And hey, you already know this. And therefore, in a way, it's topics want to kind of be highlighted and backgrounded at the same time. And so the topic marking and, you know, they develop into discourse topic markers or into emphatic markers or the narrative peak markers is running with the, this is important, I'm marking this as important here. While then the anaphoric marking and the backgrounding is the, oh, well, this is old hat, you know this. And so maybe topic marking is not very time stable because it can't really hold both functions and grammaticalizes this way and that way. But I think that speaks to your question. It's not really a full answer.
Thank you.
Thanks.